They say you can't be picky when you're desperate for work, but if I'd known what I was getting into, I might have reconsidered. A job's a job, though, and when the ad for a night groundskeeper at the Willow Cemetery popped up, I didn't hesitate to apply. The pay was decent, the hours worked with my schedule, and let's be honest, who hangs around cemeteries at night? I figured it would be peaceful, quiet. Turns out I couldn't have been more wrong. The cemetery sits on the outskirts of town, tucked behind an overgrown forest that blocks it from view unless you know where to look. It's old, so old that some of the headstones have no names, just weathered symbols etched into crumbling stone. The gates are wrought iron, tall and imposing, with intricate patterns that twist and curl like vines. I arrived just before sunset, the sky a deep orange streaked with pink, and parked my car outside the gates. The place looked like something out of a Gothic novel, all shadows and silence. A man was waiting for me at the entrance, his silhouette barely visible against the fading light. "You're the new guy?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, holding out my hand. "I'm Jake." He ignored my hand, pulling out a folded piece of paper from his jacket instead. "Name's Ed. Listen carefully, Jake. You follow these rules, you'll be fine. Ignore them and, well, let's just say nobody ignores them twice." I took the paper from him, unfolding it to reveal a list written in tight, messy handwriting. The rules. Never whistle while you're on the grounds. If you see someone standing under the willow tree, do not approach them. Leave immediately. At exactly midnight, make sure the gate is locked. If it's not, lock it and don't look outside the cemetery. Do not touch any grave marker that has fresh flowers on it, even if the flowers seem to move on their own. If you hear footsteps behind you, keep walking and don't turn around. Before leaving at dawn, check that the lantern near the mausoleum is lit. If it's not, light it and leave quickly. I frowned at the list. Is this a joke? Ed's face didn't move. "You'll see soon enough. Just do what it says." Before I could ask any more questions, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing at the gates with the list in one hand and a growing sense of unease. The first hour was uneventful. I walked the grounds, getting a feel for the layout. The headstones were arranged in neat rows, but the farther I went, the more chaotic it got. Some graves looked like they'd been dug and then abandoned, dirt piled loosely over uneven mounds. Others were marked with symbols I didn't recognize. Circles and triangles, lines crossing through strange runes. And then there was the willow tree. It stood in the center of the cemetery, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground around it was bare, the grass yellowed and dead. Even from a distance, the tree felt wrong. The air seemed heavier near it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I avoided it, sticking to the outer edges of the cemetery as the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature dropped quickly, and a thin layer of mist began to creep along the ground. By the time I reached the gate to lock it for the night, the moon was high, casting pale light over the grounds. The gate groaned as I pushed it closed, the sound echoing into the quiet. I pulled the heavy chain around the bars and clicked the padlock shut. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft, almost rhythmic, crunching against the gravel path behind me. My heart pounded as Ed's words flashed in my mind. "If you hear footsteps behind you, keep walking and don't turn around." I gripped the chain tighter, my knuckles turning white. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. The air felt thick, the mist swirling around my ankles as I forced myself to move. I walked back toward the main path, my eyes fixed on the mausoleum in the distance. The lantern hanging by its door flickered faintly, the flame struggling against the damp air. And then, from somewhere deep in the cemetery, I heard a whistle. It was sharp, clear, and out of place in the stillness. I froze, gripping the paper in my pocket. The first rule: never whistle while you're on the grounds. But I wasn't whistling. A chill ran down my spine as the sound came again, this time closer. I reached the mausoleum just as the lantern sputtered and went out. My hands shook as I pulled the lighter from my pocket, struggling to keep the flame steady in the growing wind. The whistle sounded again, low and haunting, followed by footsteps. Closer. I lit the lantern, the flame casting long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. The footsteps stopped, but the whistle didn't. It echoed through the cemetery, growing louder, more insistent. I backed away from the mausoleum, my eyes darting to the willow tree in the distance. A figure was standing beneath it. They were barely visible in the moonlight, their outline blurred by the mist. I couldn't tell if they were looking at me, but I felt their gaze like a weight pressing against my chest. The whistle stopped. The figure under the willow tree didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, blending into the shadows cast by the gnarled branches. My legs felt rooted to the ground, but my mind screamed for me to look away. Rule 2 was clear. If you see someone standing under the willow tree, do not approach them. Leave immediately. I forced myself to turn and walk back toward the main path. My hands were shaking, and the cold air seemed sharper, biting at my face. Every crunch of gravel under my boots felt deafening in the silence. Behind me, I swore I heard the faint sound of rustling leaves, though there was no breeze. When I reached the caretaker's shed near the edge of the cemetery, I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. The lantern hanging outside cast a faint glow through the cracked window, but the room was still dark and cramped, filled with tools and supplies that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I pulled the list of rules from my pocket, my fingers tracing over the worn edges. The rules didn't seem like a joke anymore. They felt like lifelines. My flashlight flickered as I turned it on, the beam weak but steady enough to illuminate the small desk in the corner. A dusty notebook sat on top, its cover faded and frayed. Curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it open, coughing as a cloud of dust rose into the air. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, some neat and precise, others scrawled as if written in a hurry. July 15, 1986, new groundskeeper started today. Gave him the rules. He laughed at first. They always do. Told him to follow them if he wanted to make it through the week. August 1st, 1986. He didn't lock the gate at midnight. Found his car abandoned outside the cemetery. He wasn't inside it. September 3rd, 1990. The willow tree was bare last night, leaves gone, branches snapping in the wind. By morning, they were back. Something's wrong with that tree. I flipped through more entries, each one more unsettling than the last. Mentions of whispers in the night, flowers that never wilted, and footsteps that came from nowhere. One note caught my eye, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. If you hear the whistle, it's already too late. Don't run. It only makes it worse. The whistle. My stomach tightened as the memory of that sound echoed in my mind. A sharp knock at the shed door snapped me out of my thoughts. My blood turned cold. It wasn't possible. I was the only one here. The knock came again, louder this time. I backed away from the door, gripping the flashlight like it could protect me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The knock came a third time, but it wasn't on the door anymore. It was on the window. I turned the flashlight toward the cracked glass, my breath catching in my throat. A face stared back at me, pale and featureless, pressed against the pane like it was trying to push through. The light flickered, and the face vanished. I didn't remember leaving the shed. One moment I was inside, and the next I was standing in the middle of the cemetery, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The lantern by the mausoleum flickered in the distance, its flame barely visible through the thickening mist. The willow tree loomed in the corner of my vision, and I forced myself not to look at it directly. My footsteps felt heavier, the ground beneath me soft and uneven. As I passed a row of graves, I noticed something strange. One of the headstones had fresh flowers at its base, bright red roses that looked freshly cut. My heart sank. Rule 4. Do not touch any grave marker that has fresh flowers on it, even if the flowers seem to move on their own. I stepped around the grave, keeping my distance, but the flowers moved. The petals trembled, as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. The stems shifted, bending toward me like they were reaching out. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over another grave. The flowers stopped moving, but their bright red color seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. When I finally reached the mausoleum, the lantern had gone out. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the lighter as I tried to ignite it. The flame sputtered, catching just enough to light the wick. As the flame grew steadier, I noticed something carved into the door of the mausoleum. It hadn't been there earlier. a single word scratched deep into the stone. Run. I didn't hear the footsteps at first. The sound was faint, like someone dragging their feet across the gravel path. But as I turned toward the gate, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Something was following me. The footsteps behind me weren't hurried. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was following me wanted me to know they were there. I kept walking, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the crunch of gravel under my boots. Rule 5. If you hear footsteps behind you, keep walking and don't turn around. I clenched my fists, the paper with the rules crumpled in my pocket, and stared straight ahead. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sweeping over rows of crooked headstones. The lantern near the mausoleum still burned faintly, a distant, wavering light that seemed so far away. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, sharper. I wanted to look, to see if there was anything there, but I couldn't risk breaking the rule. Then I heard a whisper. Jake. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but it made my blood run cold. Jake. Help me. It was coming from behind me. My breath hitched, and I picked up my pace, forcing my legs to keep moving even though every instinct screamed at me to stop. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, shifting between tones like a chorus of voices overlapping. Some were faint and pleading, others low and growling, but they all said the same thing. Jake, turn around. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs were trembling, my chest heaving as I stumbled forward. The flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering to the ground. The beam swung wildly, illuminating the misty graveyard in fractured flashes. The voices stopped. I froze, my hands clenched into fists. The silence was deafening. I dropped to my knees, fumbling for the flashlight, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. That's when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. I spun around before I could stop myself. The light from the flashlight swung with me, landing on nothing. There was no one there, but the air was heavy, suffocating, and the mist around me seemed darker, thicker. The shadows of the headstones stretched toward me, long and sharp, as if the graveyard itself was alive. I forced myself to stand, my knees shaking, and turned back toward the mausoleum. The lantern was flickering again, the flame struggling against the cold air. I took a step forward. The ground beneath me shifted. I looked down and realized, with growing horror, that I wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. The earth around me was soft, sinking under my weight. A faint groan echoed through the graveyard, low and guttural, like the earth itself was breathing. Then I saw it. A hand. It shot up from the ground just inches from my feet, pale and skeletal, its fingers clawing at the air. I stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone and landing hard on the ground. My flashlight rolled away, its beam cutting through the mist to reveal more of them. Hands, dozens of them, clawing their way out of the dirt. The whispers returned, louder now, rising into a cacophony of voices that echoed all around me. Jake, stay with us. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it wildly at the hands. The light didn't stop them. They kept reaching, clawing, their movements jerky and unnatural. I ran. The cemetery stretched endlessly before me. The paths I'd walked earlier seemed unfamiliar now, twisting and turning into unfamiliar patterns. The headstones loomed taller, their inscriptions unreadable in the thick fog. The willow tree came into view again, its twisted branches swaying despite the still air. And under it, the figure was still standing. This time, it moved. It stepped out from the shadow of the tree, its movement slow and deliberate. The mist clung to it, obscuring its features, but I could see its outline, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. I froze, the rules flashing through my mind. If you see someone standing under the willow tree, do not approach them. Leave immediately. But there was nowhere to go. The figure moved closer, each step sending a wave of cold air that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, shining the flashlight directly at it. The beam landed on its face, or what should have been a face. There were no features, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. It raised an arm, its hand outstretched, and pointed at me. You broke the rules. it said, its voice deep and hollow, echoing through the graveyard. I turned and ran, my lungs burning as I pushed myself forward. The mausoleum was my only chance. If I could make it to the lantern, maybe I could, survive? Escape? The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The ground beneath my feet shifted again, softening, as more hands clawed their way out of the earth. The lantern flickered and went out just as I reached the mausoleum. "No!" I gasped, grabbing the lighter from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely flick the wheel. The first spark died, then another. The footsteps were behind me again, faster this time, closing the distance between us. The lighter caught, the small flame barely illuminating the space around me. I reached for the lantern, but before I could light it, a shadow fell over me. "You don't belong here," the figure said, its voice right behind me. I turned, the lighter trembling in my hand, and came face to face with the smooth, featureless head. The flame went out. The darkness was absolute. The lighter in my hand had gone cold, the small flame snuffed out, as if the air itself refused to let it burn. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one loud in the oppressive silence. The figure loomed before me, its smooth, featureless head tilting as it studied me. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the ground beneath me. "You broke the rules," it said again, its voice resonating through my chest like a deep vibration. I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away until my shoulders pressed against the cold stone of the mausoleum. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, the mist swirling into shapes that disappeared as quickly as they formed. "You don't belong here," it said, the tone of its voice shifting, almost sorrowful now. "But you cannot leave." The words sent a chill through me, colder than the air clinging to my skin. My mind raced, searching for a way out, for anything that could make this nightmare end. My eyes darted to the lantern. It hung lifeless on its iron hook, the glass cracked but intact. If I could just relight it. I lunged for the lighter, flicking it desperately, the tiny sparks struggling to catch. The figure didn't stop me. It just stood there, watching, as if it already knew what would happen. The flame caught, and I quickly held it to the lantern's wick. The fire sputtered, then flared to life, casting a faint, golden glow over the mausoleum and the surrounding graves. For a moment, everything was still, and then the lantern shattered. The flame went out, leaving only shards of glass and the faint scent of burning oil. "No!" I whispered, my voice breaking. The figure stepped closer. The ground beneath my feet began to shift again, the soft earth sinking as if something below was pulling it down. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as though the cemetery itself was holding me in place. The figure leaned down, its smooth, pale head mere inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating off it, a bone-deep chill that made my entire body tremble. "This place keeps what it claims," it said, its voice now a low whisper. Before I could respond, the ground gave way completely. I fell backward, the loose earth swallowing me as if I'd stepped into quicksand. The world above grew smaller, the figure standing motionless as it watched me sink. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the willow tree, its branches swaying as though waving goodbye. When I opened my eyes, the sun was rising. The cemetery looked normal. The mist was gone. The headstones stood silent and still, and the air was warm with the first light of dawn. I was sitting on the ground near the mausoleum, the shattered lantern still hanging on its hook. My clothes were covered in dirt, my hands trembling as I wiped them against my jeans. I stumbled to my feet, every muscle in my body aching, and made my way toward the gates. They were unlocked, the heavy chain and padlock lying discarded on the ground. I didn't question it. I just walked through them, my legs moving on autopilot until I reached my car. The engine started without a problem, and I drove away, refusing to look back. I didn't realize something was wrong until I pulled into my driveway. My house was there, just as I'd left it, but something about it felt off. The curtains in the windows didn't look like mine, the paint was the wrong color, and when I reached for the door handle, my key didn't fit. I stepped back, staring at the house as dread crept over me. A woman opened the door. She looked at me with a mixture of confusion and fear, clutching a phone in one hand. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This is my house," I said, the words coming out automatically. Her expression hardened. "No, it's not. Please leave before I call the police." I backed away, my heart racing. The street around me was unfamiliar, the houses slightly wrong, like a dream that almost made sense but didn't. I got back into my car and drove aimlessly, hoping to shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I passed the cemetery, I realized the gates were gone. There was no sign of the wrought iron, no graves, no willow tree, just an empty field with tall grass swaying in the breeze. I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat there, staring at the empty lot. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure stood in the middle of the field, its head tilted, its hand raised in a slow wave. I turned the car around and drove until the gas tank was empty. But no matter where I go, I can still feel it watching me. The rules didn't just apply to the cemetery. They followed me, and now they're mine to keep.